Everyone loves the Scottish princess Merida from Brave, but the secret history of Merida is a lot crazier than the movie. Stay tuned to find out all about the real world of Brave. In 2012, Pixar Studios released their first ever Disney princess movie. Brave was a huge deal because it ushered in a new era for princesses. Merida is still the only princess from the Pixar Studios.
We can't understand her. She's from the other studio.
And the fiery redhead is a princess to be admired. Merida was the first princess to come from a completely original story. Every other princess was based on either a fairy tale or a historical figure. Mulan and Pocahontas are the historical princesses, but all the rest are based on stories. Only one other princess can claim the original story title, and that's Moana. But Merida was definitely the first. Brave is also different from other Disney princess movies in a lot of different ways. First of all, both of Merida's parents are alive, thanks Pixar. Seriously, what is up with all the lost parents in Disney movies? It's pretty much a joke at this point. Well, it's a really sad joke anyway. After all the classic princesses like Cinderella and Aurora, Disney started giving us princesses who didn't quite fit in. The 90s had a lot of independent princesses who did not need to be saved by a man. It makes sense because the 1990s was an era of girl power. It's pretty cool that Mulan saved all of China by herself, you know? But there was always a romantic tale. Not in Brave. Merida was the first princess to not have a love story. Merida does not want to get married. They originally were going to give her a love interest, but they decided Merida was just too independent for that. And it was really refreshing. Not everyone needs a love story for a happy ending. Moana followed this path, but Brave was the first. The plot. In case it's been a while since you've watched Brave, we're going to do a quick refresher, but we're pretty sure you'll want to rewatch it after this video. The movie starts of Princess Merida's 6th birthday. She is out for a picnic with her parents, King Fergus and Queen Eleanor. Fergus gives Merida her first bow and arrow, and Merida is a natural. She fires off an arrow into the woods where she sees magic blue lights called Will-o'-the-Wisp. While she's off following the magic, her parents and their men get attacked by a big scary bear named Mordu. Eleanor rushes Merida to safety. 10 years later, we find out that Fergus lost his leg to Mordu. That could have been way more tragic, but Fergus is hilarious, so we're glad all he lost was his leg.
Oh, that's my favorite part.
Merida also has triplet little brothers who are constantly up to trouble. Eleanor wants Merida to be a proper lady, but Merida just wants to do her own thing. She is definitely not your typical princess, and this causes a bunch of issues between Merida and her mom. 3 lords arrive to give their firstborn sons in marriage to Merida, but she is not having it. She chooses archery as their test, and then she competes for her own hand. Get it, girl? Merida and Eleanor get in a huge fight. Merida runs off on her horse into the woods and sees the Will-o'-the-Wisps again. The magic lights are supposed to lead you to her fate. Can we get some Will-o'-the-Wisps up in here, please? The lights take Merida to the home of a witch. Merida asks for a spell that will change her mother, which she thinks will change her fate of marriage. Unfortunately, the spell changes her mother a little too much. Eleanor turns into a giant bear. Fergus thinks that the bear is Mordu and tries to attack it. Merida has to take her mother to safety. They bond as mother bear and daughter, but Eleanor is turning into a real bear. Merida learns this has happened before, and Mordu is actually a cursed king. With her mom's help, Merida helps unite all the fighting lords with her father's army. There's a big fight, and Mordu meets his end. Merida apologizes to her mother, and Eleanor turns back into a human. Merida doesn't have to get married, and the different clans are united. Choosing your own destiny is important. We love that message. The history of Brave. Okay, it's safe to assume no one was getting turned into giant bears in ancient Scotland. But what was really going on in the country above England? Scotland has a long and often violent history, but Merida's fiery spirit and belief in choosing her own destiny is a super Scottish attitude. Brave really captures the fierce spirit of the Scots.
Our fate lives within us.
According to Disney, Brave takes place in the 10th century Scotland. That's the 900s, so it was over 1,000 years ago. That also makes Merida one of the oldest Disney princesses. This time period was known as the High Middle Ages, and in far north Europe, it was known as the Viking Age. Vikings? Can we get a Brave and How to Train Your Dragon mashup? That would be epic. One of the coolest things about Scottish history is that they managed to keep the Romans from invading. The ancient Romans conquered everyone, and they took over almost all of England. They tried really hard to take over Scotland or Caledonia, but they were no match for the fierce warriors of the Picts. The Picts are awesome. They would tattoo their skin with all sorts of designs in blue ink. They looked really intimidating to their enemies, and boy, could they fight. The Picts didn't have a bunch of impressive technology like the Romans, but they were one of the only groups in the world to beat them. The Scottish pride started really early. Merida and Fergus definitely got some of that spunkiness. The Picts were one of the main kingdoms in Scotland at this time, but there were several other kingdoms. There were the Angles, the Britons, and the Gaels, along with some smaller kingdoms. Many of these were united into the Pictish kingdom, but then they faced lots of raids from the Vikings. The Vikings managed to take control of a bunch of the northern and western islands, and then there was a lot of fighting on the mainland. Many of the people in Scotland had converted to Christianity, but the Vikings worshipped Norse gods. This caused even more bloody conflict. In the year 900, a guy named Constantine Mac Ed became king of the Picts, and he took a totally different approach to deal with the Vikings. Instead of violence, Constantine used diplomacy. At that time, that mostly meant marrying off his daughters to Viking war leaders. Hey, why didn't his daughters get any say in this? Well, unfortunately, women didn't really have any rights, especially princesses. Marriage for love was unheard of among royals. Marriage was used to strengthen alliances. That seems really messed up these days, but that is the way it was. Of course, that is why Merida is such a great princess, and why we love her story. All of the clans under her father's rule hated each other, and Merida was expected to marry one of them to make sure there was peace.
It's marriage, it's not the end of the world.
Eleanor was probably married off to Fergus for the same reason, but they definitely seemed to love each other. We're glad we don't have to marry to prevent war anymore. Constantine's dad, Kenneth MacAlpine, was the first real king. He united many of the Gaels and the Picts, but Constantine took it a step further. Then we have to deal with a guy with a really strange name. Athelstan was an early king of the Anglo-Saxons, which was the group of people in England. After the Vikings were more or less defeated, Athelstan gets it in his head that he can take over Scotland. Weird flex, but okay. This dude needs some history lessons. Trying to take over Scotland never ends well. Constantine and his armies hole up at Dunatar Castle. This castle is epic. It looks like something straight out of a fairy tale, or maybe Game of Thrones. It's high up on a cliff over the sea, and it's really hard to attack. Athelstan tries his best to siege Dunatar Castle, but the Scots are too strong and too well defended. Athelstan lost, but Constantine was mad. He decides to try to take over England in retaliation. Hey, what happened to diplomacy? He must have been out of daughters to marry off. Constantine called on all his allies. The armies of the Britons, the Angles, and the Vikings joined him for war. Constantine was defeated, but he put up a pretty good fight. Athelstan gave up on trying to invade Scotland. Those Scots were just too fierce. King Fergus. Merida's goofy but tough dad was not a real person, and Fergus is a really common name in Scottish history, but it is totally possible that some of the inspiration for the king and brave came from a real King Fergus. He didn't live in the 10th century when the movie takes place, and he wasn't really a king. Fergus of Galloway lived in the 1100s. Galloway is a small region of Scotland, and it's likely that he was just the leader of the most powerful family in that region. He had 3 sons, just like the Fergus from Brave. He formed a martial alliance with the country that is now Ireland, and he did try to take over some land in southern Scotland. But overall, he wasn't a bad guy. He set up a bunch of churches and monasteries. He had managed to resist Scotland rule for a long time, but he eventually was defeated. There is also some speculation that one of King Arthur's knights was actually based on Fergus of Galloway. The Tartan. Merida and her family are part of a fictional clan, Dunbroch. They wear a green tartan. A tartan is a plaid fabric that Scottish people use to represent their clans or families. Not only is the Dunbroch clan made up, but the tartan and brave is impossible to make in real life.
What? You just cheated.
Tartans were born by Scottish people for centuries, but they were banned for a while in the 1700s. Once Scotland became part of England, the English Parliament tried to ban all the important parts of Scottish culture. But tartans made a comeback in 1822. By then, a lot of the weavers and original patterns were lost, so clans had to create new tartan patterns. It's almost not clear if tartans were worn before the 1500s. But if Eleanor and Merida were real, they probably would have not worn the same tartan. Women typically wore dress tartans, which had a white background and lighter patterns. Do any of you of Scottish heritage know what your family's tartan looks like? Not quite historic. Although the Disney Wiki says Brave takes place in the 10th century, there are several historically wrong things in the movie. First of all, bears were likely extinct in Scotland way before the movie. They eat haggis, a traditional Scottish meal made in a sheep's stomach, but haggis was not around for another few hundred years. The style of Merida's dress and the bagpipes date to the 1300s, and then there are the clan wars. Although clans likely fought each other early on, the clan feuds in Brave sound a lot like the clan feuds of later times. During the 10th century, the battles were largely against Vikings or other ethnic groups, not individual clans. The first real clan war that is documented didn't occur until 1340, and it lasted 140 years. This was also happening during the Wars of Independence, when Scotland was trying to resist English rule, which they managed to do for a few hundred years. The clan wars that occurred throughout Scottish history were incredibly violent, and when these clans fought amongst themselves, it was hard to fight off the English. Eventually, Scotland did become part of Great Britain, although they maintained some independent rights. This streak of independence is an amazing trait of Scottish people throughout history, and we think our favorite Scottish princess captured this fierceness and independence perfectly. Brave might not be the most popular Disney movie, but it's definitely one of the most interesting. Merida is one of the coolest princesses because she's a fighter and doesn't need a man. She's a totally original character, and the history behind Brave is so interesting. It was a lot more violent than just fighting off a magic bear, but it is a Disney movie after all. What is your favorite part of Brave? Sound off in the comment section. And that's the bloody secret history behind Brave. Be sure to like this video and click that big red subscribe button. See you next time.